Howdy, howdy. So, welcome to Boost ABA Exam Prep mini lectures. My name is Abigail Petronelli. I am a product development associate here at ABA Technologies, working primarily within the Boost test prep line. And today I'm going to talk to you about performance diagnostics. So, a little bit of information about me. I have my master's in organizational behavior management, and I'm currently working on my PhD in OBM as well. So, performance diagnostics is a topic I'm really interested in and really well versed in. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I will note that this video is not meant to supplement any form of course teachings, but really just to help give a broad overview of what performance diagnostics are and their relevance to practice and, of course, the exam itself. That being said, I do want to give the disclaimer that the Boost ABA exam prep products and services are offered independently of the BACB, and Boost staff represent ABA Technologies and are not affiliated with the BACB. So just wanted to add this disclaimer here. So I wanted to start off this video with a little bit of a scenario. So let's just say you are now a BCBA and you are a supervisor overseeing a series of technicians. And you observe that recently one of your technicians has a lack of treatment fidelity in a behavior reduction program or protocol. And really previously they had conducted this intervention with really high fidelity, but now that's changed and it's such to an extent that it's now impacting client progress as there is now an increase in problem behavior. And so I ask you, in this situation where you are this supervisor to this technician, what would you do? Do you train them? Do you reprimand or write them up? Do you give them some form of prompt? Do you give them feedback on their performance? Do you maybe fire them just because of now the impact it's having on client progress? Or do you do something else? I asked you to kind of sit with what your answer would be, because we're actually going to take a pause and come back to this in a bit, and you'll understand why in a couple slides. I actually want to shift gears to talk about a clinical scenario, as I'm predicting many of the viewers here are clinically oriented. And let's just say that I'm now a clinician, and a client of mine has recently had an increase in maladaptive behaviors and a decrease in functional living skills. And let's just go ahead and say that I've already assessed that the treatment fidelity of my staff members is still high. Yet this client is still engaging in these different behaviors that increase in those maladaptive behaviors and a decrease in that functional living skills. So what should I do? I'm thinking of a couple options. I'm thinking about maybe implementing some FCT for that problem behavior, maybe even using a little bit of a timeout protocol to address those maladaptive behaviors, perhaps implementing a token economy, or maybe running more sessions of DTT to help address those functional living skills that have, decreased in maybe their frequency or accuracy. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, Evie, you should do none of the above. You don't know what's going on. You need to assess first. We need to first rule out medical causes. Is there a medical reason why there's this change in this client behaviors? We need to conduct some observations and gather additional data. We need to conduct some functional assessments, right? So what is the maintaining function of this client's behavior? I shouldn't really throw FCT at something or using a timeout protocol unless I'm sure what the function of the behavior is. And why do we do this? Because we know that the function of behavior matters. Our interventions should be informed by the function, because function-based interventions are more effective. And so with that in mind of the importance of assessment before we jump into intervention, let's go back to our staff scenario. Again, we have this individual who is now exhibiting a lack of treatment fidelity when previously they were doing it really well. And so, I had asked, what would you do? Would you train him, reprimand him? Well, those are all forms of intervention. So really, what should you do and what should you do first is you should assess first, just like you would with a client. And how do we assess staff member performance? We can't really throw them into a functional analysis, right? Well, you use something called performance diagnostics. So, what are, broadly speaking, performance diagnostics? So the board is using this term performance diagnostics. They're not specifying a specific assessment, though that term is within a specific type of assessment, which I'll talk about in later slides. But broadly speaking, they are really referring to this assessment of potential functions or controlling variables impacting behavior of performance of staff members. So essentially diagnosing the performance problem. Its aim is to identify a function-based solution. You can really think of performance diagnostics as just a form of functional assessment. Again, we can't really throw staff members into a functional analysis, but we can take similar approaches to functional assessment via things like interviews and observations with staff members, just like we do with clients. And so in performance diagnostics, we're really focused on identifying variables that may be impacting performance. With staff members, there's likely a broad range and variety of different things that are impacting the behavior of our staff members. And that can include things like maybe the capacity of the performers themselves, again, those immediate environmental contingencies, resources, processes. Some of these things, maybe aren't as applicable to a client, but are certainly applicable when we're talking about staff members and staff performance. And so in performance diagnostics, we're using typically observations and or interviews to ultimately determine why is the staff member engaging in this performance or why aren't they engaging in this desirable performance or behavior. And so there's actually a wide range of different types of performance diagnostic tools or functional assessment tools in OBM. You could do something like an ABC analysis, that same ABC analysis you do with your clients. You could do this with a staff member. You can use something called a picnic analysis. I've cited the Daniels and Bailey book. This is a tool developed by Aubrey Daniels. You can use something called the Performance Diagnostic Checklist, which again, that term performance diagnostic is likely pulling from, often called the PDC. This was developed by John Austin, but there's also variations. You're probably most familiar with the human services version, so that's the PDC-HS, but there's also a PDC Safety, I believe a PDC Parent, and perhaps some others as well. I also want to include the Human Performance System, or the HPS. This is one of the earliest tools, perhaps maybe the earliest. I don't want to make that strict claim though. This was created by Rumler, Brethauer, and Geiss. So I am going to talk about that a little bit. That was developed in the 1960s. There's Binder 6 boxes, though, like the picnic, it is kind of a trademark tool, but there are others as well. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these and see what this looks like in practice throughout this presentation. So let's start with a good old-fashioned ABC analysis. And let me give you this scenario here, that we have a clinician who's implementing a DTT procedure incorrectly. Specifically, they're delivering the reinforcer to the client if they respond correctly after 5 seconds. But per the protocol, if the client responds correctly after 5 seconds, they should just get a neutral statement from the staff member. But they're doing it wrong, so they should be withholding that reinforcer and just providing a neutral statement, but instead this staff member is still delivering the reinforcer, even though 5 seconds has passed. So why are they doing that? Again, it may be really tempting. Oh, we need to retrain them on the protocol of when they should be implementing this procedure. But let's actually investigate this a little bit further. So I have kind of a really basic ABC here, and you would, do multiple instances of this, but just to kind of give you a general idea. We have the antecedent here. The client responds correctly after 5 seconds. What's the behavior? What does the staff member do? They provide a neutral statement, but withhold the reinforcer. And well, what is the consequence of that? Maybe it's client aggression and pretty severe injury. So in this case, they have followed the protocol, right? All right, next time we say the client responds correctly within 5 seconds, and the staff member correctly engages in the desired performance. They praise and delivers a reinforcer because the client responded within the time frame of 5 seconds. And the consequence of that is that there's no aggression. The staff member avoids the aggression because that client is playing with the item. They got the reinforcer. And then we say in this bottom one here, another instance, the client responds correctly after 5 seconds. So what should they do? Well, they should just provide a neutral statement and withhold the reinforcer, right? But we actually see here, they provide that neutral statement, but they deliver the reinforcer anyway. So this is our performance problem here. What's the consequence of that? Well, the client plays with the item and no aggression occurs, no injury occurs. And so, you would gather multiple instances of this data, but you may be able to start seeing this pattern of, oh, wow, like perhaps the staff member is not following the protocol as listed to avoid the injury or aggression, right? In which case that may inform what solution you develop. So maybe they got a really severe injury that first time, and this may be a call that you need to start implementing some protective equipment to help reduce the severity of the injuries. We try and prevent aggression as much as we can, but sometimes our best bet is to train and give staff members the appropriate resources to handle client aggression, for example. So that's just an example with the ABC analysis. Or you can do a picnic analysis. Picnic analysis is very similar to an ABC analysis. I like to call it an ABC analysis plus. In a picnic analysis, though, you are first identifying two behaviors. So this undesirable behavior that staff members are currently engaging in, and this desirable behavior that you want them to be doing, but what they're not currently doing. You identify the antecedents, and you identify the consequences. But with the consequences, you add this additional consequence analysis, in which for each potential consequence for both the desired and undesired behavior, You will note if that consequence is positive or negative, and I'm meaning like a good or bad. So is this something we want or don't want? So it's not, in the sense of reinforcement or punishment, additive or removal of a stimulus. Positive or negative here just means good or bad. Is it immediate or delayed? And is it certain or uncertain to occur? So thinking about like probability. And so let me give you an example again. So we have a staff member who's been submitting session notes that are copy and pasted. Undesirable behavior that they're currently engaging in, copy and pasting session notes. What do we want them to be doing? Writing novel session notes. So we can conduct a picnic analysis. So here is for the undesirable behavior, copy and pasting the session notes. The antecedent, it's the end of the day, they see this list of session notes they got to complete. Well, what are some consequences for copy and pasting them? Well, it's faster. It's also less effortful. But they may get reprimanded by their supervisor for copy and pasting them. For each of these consequences, and we can also list other ones, but I just have 3 here, we would do this consequence analysis. We assess for each consequence, is it positive or negative? Is it immediate or delayed? And is it certain or uncertain? For something like faster and less effortful, this is a positive consequence, right? It's positive in the perception of the staff member themselves. They can get it done, and it's the end of the day, they can go home earlier. It also impacts them in the immediate, and it's also certain every single time copy and pasting session notes is going to be faster and less effortful than writing novel ones. Now, for reprimanded, though, that's something negative. Who wants to get reprimanded or written up? But it's a more delayed consequence. It may be occurring the next day, maybe even the next week. And it's also not occurring after every single session note. So it's pretty uncertain. So we see that there's a whole lot of picks for the undesirable behavior, and any negatives tend to be pretty delayed, right? And remember, when we're talking about consequences, immediacy and certainty of those consequences tends to have a greater impact. But we do the same thing with the desirable behavior to kind of draw this comparison, right? So what we want them to be doing is writing novel session notes. But again, what are some consequences of those? Well, it takes longer. It's more effortful. But maybe they get praise for their writing of novel session notes. We do again that consequence analysis. And again, that longer time it takes, the more effort, those are all negative things that are impacting the performer in that moment and are certain it will always take longer and be more effortful to write novel session notes. And while you can get praise for writing the novel session notes, and that's something positive, again, it's more delayed, maybe occurring the next day, and it's also uncertain. Maybe they don't get praise every single time. And so when you compare your consequences and the additional analyses of your undesirable and desirable behavior, you can actually start to see, oh, I can kind of understand why staff members are guiding and gearing more towards copy and pasting the session notes rather than writing novel ones. Again, when we're talking about performance diagnostics, our whole aim is really just to assess why are they doing this without any form of judgment. When you do this assessment, then you can go with, help determine what are some function-based solutions. So here it may just be trying to implement more frequent positive consequences for writing of those novel session notes, for example. So that was the picnic analysis. Now I'm going to get into some maybe interview types of performance diagnostics. So again, a big one is the PDC. Again, it's a type of performance analysis, and there are of course many variations as well. It includes different questions for different categories or domains, and these differ depending on your type of PDC. So there's usually something about equipment, knowledge and antecedents, consequences, etc. But it utilizes interview questions to help identify controlling variables. Typically, you're doing an interview with a supervisor, but it is recommended, though, or I recommend at least, that you combine it with observations of staff members as well. So here's an example of the PDC. I pulled this from an article. It's not the original article. The PDC was developed within. That is, again, by John Austin. But as you can see, we have these different domains. So here, antecedents and information, equipment and processes, and different questions underneath them. You would conduct this interview, and from this would ask, of course, follow-up questions to get a little bit more information and essentially determine, are these, is this a yes or no? So is the equipment, is it equipment required? Is it reliable? They may say, oh no, it's not equipment is required, but it's not very reliable. It's kind of sometimes doesn't work as expected. Well, that would be a no, for example. Or like, is it in good working order? Hey, yeah, the equipment's actually really in good working order, so that'd be a yes. When you do something like a PDC at the end, you then compare the no's in the different domains, and from that can assess what type of intervention you need to be looking at. So if you have a lot of no's in your consequences, that indicates that your intervention should be more of a consequence-based intervention. So something like maybe more monitoring, feedback, etc. Here I have the PDCHS. Again, very similar to the PDC, although this is actually an outdated version, I will note. But again, similar domains, slightly different phrasing. So we have training, task clarification and prompting, and so forth. And again, answering these questions, identifying yes, no, and determining based on the number of no's, what kind of intervention you should be working with. Again, if you have a lot of no's in training, this may indicate training is the solution that you're looking for. I did want to input the HPS here as well. Again, this is one of the earliest tools. Um, it follows a really similar format in form of questions, right? Again, interview questions, and you combine it with observations. I just like how it outlines this model of a performer to kind of showcase, at what point these different domains have an impact on the performer, right? So we're talking about, hey, what are some things that need to be done for him, that task support? What are the requirements of the performer themselves, their knowledge and skills, their capacity to engage in the performance or behavior? Things like performance specifications. Hey, what are the consequences of engaging in the performance, and do they get any feedback on their performance, which loops back into, how they should perform in future opportunities. Again, similar approach here, series of questions, ultimately to assess potential controlling variables for staff member behavior and what areas are highlighted for potential improvement. Similarly with the PDCHS, areas with no's may indicate greater need. And you actually, if you compare these two questions to the PDC, you'll find a lot of overlap. That being said, I do encourage you to look beyond tools. So don't just run the tools and see whatever it spits out. You really don't need to understand the principles behind the tools. Many OBM interventions tend to have overlapping effects. So while prompting may be the area with the most no's, if you see some in the feedback domains of PDCHS, HPS, or when you're looking at your picnics or ABC analysis, whatever you're going to be using, you may actually find that, hey, something like feedback, while that wasn't the most prominent domain with no's, may actually be really helpful, because feedback is a consequence intervention, but can also serve as a prompt if you deliver it before the next opportunity. And so kind of understanding principles is really key to ensuring you select the correct intervention. Don't just run the tools and see whatever it spits out, because you may not be implementing the best and most effective solution to the performance problem. And just ultimately, if you don't understand the concepts behind these tools, you may not apply or interpret them correctly. So again, that performance diagnostic process, you run whatever form of assessment, whether that's a PDC, whether that's a picnic, an ABC. You don't have to do all of them. When you're working with staff members, you can directly ask them, hey, I've noticed that this has been going on. Are there any barriers impacting your performance? You can directly ask them as well. This doesn't have to be the most formal of things, especially for maybe smaller instances of concerns, right? But you conduct your performance diagnostic assessment and you analyze the results. From those results, you select your intervention. And again, the different results you get from your performance diagnostics will yield different recommendations. And so going back to that initial staff scenario of the individual with low treatment fidelity, now when they previously had really high treatment fidelity, well, let's just say that it revealed that the staff member lacks the necessary safety gear to implement the procedure. So maybe those materials were broken or inaccessible. You don't need to train for that. You just need to get access to those materials. That is the solution for this type of problem. But maybe in a different world, for the same staff scenario, the performance diagnostics and our observations conclude that the client precursor behaviors have changed, and this staff member isn't really sure when to begin implementing the protocol. So maybe the concern specifically is that their low treatment integrity was that they weren't starting the protocol when they should have been, because now there's novel client behaviors. Well, the solution here is to clarify the task. You might not need to do a full training. You just may need to clarify, hey, when the client also begins engaging in these behaviors, you also need to begin implementing the behavioral protocol as well. And a final example, maybe in this scenario, you did performance diagnostics and observations and concluded that the consequences don't align with the desired performance. In which case, the solution here is to incorporate more reinforcing consequences. Maybe it's providing that positive feedback. If your organization uses something like a token economy for staff behavior, maybe it's to start doing that, incorporating more reinforcing consequences to encourage the desired behavior or performance. So I hope that was helpful for you all. Really, the whole point of this lecture this mini lecture, is to just get you thinking about the same contingencies that impact your clients. impact your staff members' behavior as well. It may be really tempting to, jump to saying, oh, these staff members are lazy or I just need to train them. But just like you would assess the changes in client behavior, you also need to be assessing the changes in your staff behavior to ultimately determine the best and most effective solution to addressing those problems.